for the Personal Protective Equipment Are We Covered webinar. My name is Catherine Gutierrez, and I will be your host for the presentation. Dennis Truitt, our Vice President of Account Management here at PICS, will be leading the presentation on personal protective equipment. Dennis comes to us with more than 25 years of experience in the safety, health, and environmental background. And what we'll do is go ahead and share with you how to ask a question for the presentation. I will also talk to you about the slides for the presentation at the conclusion of the presentation, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. To ask a question, please open the chat panel. In the Send To drop-down list, you'll want to select the host. That will come directly to us. You'll enter the message in the text box that you want to send. And depending upon whether you have a Windows or a Mac system, you will click Send if you have a Windows system, or click Enter if you have a Mac system. The questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, so you do have the duration of the webinar to think of any questions that you would like to have asked by or answered by Dennis, to go ahead and put those into the chat panel, and then we will be covering those at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to turn the time over to Dennis Truitt to begin our presentation on personal protective equipment. Are we covered?
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you on the call, and hopefully we can talk about PPE and a number of different parameters surrounding that very critical piece of what we do in the heavy industry and in any industry. So let's start off with a few questions. What is PPE? And real simply, it is equipment worn to minimize exposure to a variety of hazards. Why is it important for us to be concerned with? A number of different reasons. Besides, all the good things like regulatory and best practices, we really want to protect our employees. We really want to protect our folks, one of our great assets in all types of business that we do. When we can't use engineering, work practice, or administrative controls, and we just simply can't engineer that hazard out or remove that hazard or remove that position just so that we can't take that potential injury or loss away, we've got to turn to PPE, and that's one of the biggest reasons why we have it. Who's responsible for PPE? When employers and employees work together, that equals success. Pretty simple terms, but really we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that ties together and how we as employers and our employees can come together and work a process that equals a whole lot less loss. Are you and your employees covered? We're going to go ahead and get into that and find out first off by starting with some of the different faces of hazards that we might see in our industry. And when I say industry, I'm really talking in very global terms. We want to really address this presentation to all facets of work environment. So don't think about this in just areas that might be heavily process-ridden areas or specifically a heavy industry with high volatile chemicals and things of that nature. We really want to talk about all areas of our work environment, whether it's a office administrative building all the way up to a refinery or chemical plant or something of the nature that would have obviously a few more hazards associated with it. So as we go through our plants and our offices and our work environments, we want to look for things. We want to look for sharp edges. And within the sharp edges category, we've got contact with, against, caught in, or between. A whole host of ways that employees could be affected by the different working environments and the different potential hazards they may come in contact with. Falling objects. Oftentimes we think about falling objects coming from heights or elevated heights when working from elevated heights or from working on scaffolds or ladders or stairs or any kind of working environment that is from a height. But we've also got this situation we have to take a look at from the same level. There's that potential for a falling object even at the same level. Flying objects, a whole host of things that we could look at there, sparks and other airborne hazards, anything that's going to be a projectile in the air. We may have to, in some situations, protect our employees from those situations with a good PPE program. Chemicals, obviously, splashes, spills, releases, and explosions, those are things that may pose a hazard, and we need to be prepared for those. Noise, environmental, biological, some other areas that we want to take a look at when we're walking through our facility and ensuring that we've identified those potential hazards that are out there. A couple more we want to take a look at. They're very common in many different industries. Electricity, obviously, is a hazard we have to deal with. Machinery, much of what we do in the working environment involves machinery and is not just the human aspect of it. Radiation, those facilities that use radiation, we've got to be aware of those hazards associated with that. Temperature extremes. You know, we're here in Southern California and we're coming into some warm area, warm time of the year. We're going to be looking at heat stress. You know, folks that work in desert climates are going to be dealing with heat stress a whole lot more throughout the year. But we've also got the other end of that, you know, folks that are working in climates where it's cold. You've got some extreme temperatures to deal with. Flammable materials, obviously a big one that runs the gamut when it comes to even retail gas stations and any areas that use fueling or have fueling on site. A whole host of other dangerous situations we might need to be aware of and how to protect our employees. And so as we talk about looking at our hazard assessment, taking a look at our situations that might require PPE, we want to keep these in mind. So what's the regulatory side of PPE? Our personal protective equipment regulatory, most of it comes out of OSHA, and OSHA's got some requirements. Again, if you're calling in from an area or location that isn't governed by OSHA, we do have some folks calling in from international locations. There are likely some level of regulatory requirement that may be a management system. It may be a higher level, may not be as detailed as some of the OSHA regulations when we talk about individual body parts being protected, but there are certainly management systems that would say you are responsible as an employer to protect your employees. Again, if we step back to one of the definitions is if we can't engineer the hazard out and we can't administratively remove that hazard, then we've got to protect our employees. So even though we may reference some OSHA standards here, these are good practices and practices that will inevitably help your business maintain a level of safety when it comes to personal protective equipment. So OSHA does require that employers protect their employees from workplace hazards that can cause injury. Employers are required to pay for almost all personal protective equipment that is required by OSHA's general industry, construction, and maritime standards. Employers will pay for replacement PPE used to comply with OSHA standards. And a comment there is, however, when an employee has lost or intentionally damaged PPE, the employer is not required to pay for its replacement. We could talk about what is and what isn't in a lot of detail. In the next slide, I'll give a couple of examples. But at the end of the day, if it's a required personal protective equipment, at least under the OSHA guidelines, the employer is required to provide that personal protective equipment at no cost to the employee. The standard does not require employers to pay for uniforms. When we talk about uniforms, we're talking about a standard uniform you might wear to work, not necessarily a uniform that would include personal protective equipment. For any of the folks that work in refineries, FRCs are one of the standard issue type products, and those can in some situations are considered uniforms. In other situations they are considered personal protective equipment. Items worn to keep clean or other items that are not PPE, again, would not be required to be covered by the employer. And the standard contains exceptions for certain ordinary protective equipment, such as safety toe footwear, prescription safety eyewear, everyday clothing, and weather-related gear and logging boots. And it depends on your industry and the type of PPE that's required there, but take a look at those situations. We do have the often employees have their own PPE, and we want to at least talk about some of those situations and those conditions. So if an employee chooses to use their own PPE, employers are not required to reimburse the employer for the PPE. Employers cannot require employees to provide their own PPE, and the employee's use of PPE they already own must be completely voluntarily. And the last bullet point there is really, when we talk about employee-owned PPE, we want to make sure that it's meeting. We want to make sure that that PPE is meeting the same standards that our own employer-owned, employer-sponsored, employer-responsible personal protective equipment. So we'll need to take a look at that personal protective equipment, make sure it meets the right standards, make sure it fits right, all the same parameters that we would use for our employer-provided and owned equipment. Employers are responsible for performing a hazard assessment of the workplace to identify and control physical and health hazards. This is a big part of it, and many of you have probably already performed this feature, this function, and have learned probably many of the potential hazardous areas and hazardous conditions in your plant by doing this. If you haven't done it, there's plenty of opportunity to go through that process, that hazard assessment, and decide what in the workplace is going to pose those types of hazards so we can protect our employees from it. Identifying and providing appropriate PPE for employees. We want to train the employees in the use and care of the PPE. Again, these are our employer responsibilities for our good people working for us. Maintaining the personal protective equipment, including replacing worn or damaged PPE. There's a number of different ways to attack this. We'll talk a little bit more in detail later. But there's lots of ways that you can engage the employee in this level and ensure that they're doing a lot of the self-inspection prior to wearing and prior to donning the equipment. Periodically reviewing and updating and evaluating the effectiveness of the PPE program. And we'll see in a slide a little bit later, there's lots of reasons why personal protective equipment may change. There's lots of reasons why we may need to adapt to certain situations to, again, understand, identify, mitigate those hazards whenever possible. So what are employees responsible for? We talked a little bit about what the employer is responsible. We want to talk about the employees. They are responsible for wearing the proper PPE and wearing it properly. There's a number of different ways that people have engaged in conditions that may be considered unsafe, and the PPE is designed to be worn in a certain fashion and in a certain way that was designed to protect the employee. Attending training sessions on how to properly don and doff the personal protective equipment. One of our responsibilities as an employer is to ensure they know how to put it on and how to take it off correctly. And it might seem like an easy thing, taking off PPE, but there are certain situations where the removal of the PPE in situations may be more hazardous than actually donning it. So we have to be careful depending on the exposure, and one example of that might be in a decon, in a decontamination situation. We want to make sure that they understand exactly what the safe procedure for removing that PPE is. And obviously, if they don't get the PPE put on correctly in the first place, it may not do what it was intended to do. And so we have to make sure that they understand that. And training is one of the best ways to do that. Actual live training, going through the process of putting it on, taking it off. And it can be something as simple as, we're pretty confident that most of our employees can don the mandatory simple PPE items like, safety glasses and hard hats, but there are insertable earplugs that can be difficult to get a good seal, and so there is a technique for that. Obviously, there's some techniques out there for donning and doffing equipment that would be beyond your standard PPE, things like SCBAs or level A suits, things that might need even the help of somebody else to ensure that it's properly protecting the employee. Inspection prior to wearing the personal protective equipment. We ought to make sure our employees are looking for the damage, the wear and tear, and the breakthrough. And while wear and tear might seem simple, breakthrough would be a good example of respiratory protection. If we're wearing a particular filter that's filtering out a particulate or some type of airborne hazard, there is an opportunity for the employee to engage with the surrounding situations and determine, hey, this is not working anymore. I need a new filter, or I've got breakthrough with different types of gloves and barrier systems and things of that nature. Care for, clean, maintain PPE. Those are things that we can engage the employees to help us with. Obviously, we may have a warehouse or an area where the PPE is turned in at the end of the day or at the end of the shift or at the end of its use or whatever, and any of that PPE that can be reused can be cleaned, maintained, and reissued. Some of it may have to be discarded and taken out of service if necessary. Inform a supervisor of the need to repair or replace the PPE. So again, we want to engage our employees and really partner with them to have that success with a program like this. All right, so let's take a look at the hazard assessment a bit and dive into that and try and come up with some ideas and some ways that we can determine what are those hazards present in our facility, both physical and health hazards. To identify the site facility PPE requirements, potential hazards may be physical or health related, and a comprehensive health assessment, or excuse me, hazard assessment should identify the hazards in both categories. So what are some examples of physical hazards that we might see? Moving objects, fluctuating temperatures. We talked about some of these earlier in our identifying of some of the potential dangers in working environments. High intensity lighting, rolling or pinching points, electrical connections and sharp edges, and many different types of sharp edges, not just corners of countertops and file cabinets, but sharp edges that employees may engage with through different types of working situations. Health hazard examples are overexposure to harmful dust, chemicals, or radiation. Any of these types of hazards can and should be looked at when we're determining our hazard assessment. So as we do a walkthrough of our working environment, our facility, our office space, whatever that location looks like, you want to make sure you walk through your site and your facility, get a sense for the basic layout, and develop your list of potential hazards. We've got things like impact, penetration, compression, the rollover, chemical, heat, cold, harmful dust, light, radiation and biological, a number of different things that we're going to be exposed to. And keep in mind as you're doing that, as employees move from one location to another, whether it's from a warehouse to an outside storage area, or they're working outside in facilities that have the potential to have changing conditions. So if an employee is scheduled outside all day long and they start early in the morning, or they finish their shift late in the evening, then we've got to take a look at, how do we protect them from those hazards, and safety glasses would be a perfect example of that. And we may want them to have 2 sets of safety glasses, one set of clear safety glasses for those times when the light is not so intense, and then later on when the light is intense, they may need to have a darker version of those safety glasses. Just a simple example of how conditions in the environment can change. What else to look for? How can these items potentially impact your employees? We've got sources of electricity. Even in simple low voltage areas in office locations, we've got that potential for hazard. Sources of motion, such as machines or processes where movement may exist that could result in an impact between personnel and equipment. One of the things that we like to do as safety professionals and safety folks is try and determine when and where we can have that impact on actually moving an employee away from a potential hazard, slightly to the left, slightly to the right, raise them up a little, lower them down, move them an inch there, have a machine guarding tool, whatever it might be that puts that human right out of that source of potential hazard. We've got high temperatures, as we spoke of before, types of chemicals. We've got to look at sources of harmful dust, sources of light radiation, falling or dropping objects, sharp objects, biological hazards, such as blood or other infected material. And that's sometimes one of the things that we forget about. We've got the bloodborne pathogens program that would hopefully help us and maintain that level of barrier between an injured employee and the first responder or somebody that may be providing first aid care. So what do we do with the hazard assessment? Well, we want to use it. We want to take that hazard assessment, we want to analyze that data to effectively determine the proper PPE for the workplace. And if it's as simple as a hard hat and safety glasses and earplugs, great. If it's as expansive as an emergency responder, a hazmat responder, a first responder, something of that nature that we get into a much higher level PPE, including breathing air in certain situations, and we want to take a look at those. Reassess when changes in conditions occur. Conditions can change daily. Conditions can change by the moment, as most of you know. So we want to make sure that we can capture that essence of what might change in the work environment. When processes change, so if we have a process and that process changes, we may have to take a look at go back to our hazard assessment and determine if the PPE is still correct and still providing the same level of protection it was intended to and originally designed for. And then reassess when injuries and incidents have occurred. This is one of the best things you can do with your incident investigation procedure and program, is really drive down into that and determine, can we set some engineering and administrative controls in place in motion to protect employees in the future when we see these situations happen. If we can't, do we have the right PPE? Was it the fault of the PPE? Was it a situation that the PPE would have or would not have contributed to the incident itself? So those are some great tools you can use in your program to ensure that while you're doing your investigation, you've got lots of information coming in, typically about all the different connections through immediate causes and basic causes and all the losses that occurred. And then document the hazard assessment so that you can, again, go back and reevaluate when necessary. So once we've performed our hazard assessment, we do need to select our PPE, and we don't want to automatically assume that price drives all PPE purchases and selections. And I put this bullet point in here, and I think it's a really important fact, is that if you remember that PPE that fits well and is comfortable will get used. And you've got the whole protection versus exposure situation, and one size fits all is not always the case. Now, there are lots of PPE out there that obviously comes in a one size fits all with minor tweaks and changes to the adjustment or to the fit so that it will fit most people. A hard hat, for example, that has a ratchet system built into the suspension headpiece will accommodate multiple sizes of heads, and in most cases it may fit a one size fits all. But you don't want your employee, obviously, or employees to be overburdened with PPE that doesn't fit or isn't comfortable. And I'm not saying this has to be high fashion or the perfect fit, but it just needs to be something that they'll wear, and we encourage them to continue to wear it for their safety and for the safety of those around them. Safe, designed well, compatible, and reliable. That's a whole mouthful right there. But there are a lot of good companies out there that have done a lot of work to ensure that the personal protective equipment they're building, that they're designing, meets the needs of our current hazards and our hazard assessments. OSHA and American National Safety Institute, ANSI, for proper regulatory guidance. There are lots and lots of guidance and best practices with the different standards for the different types of PPE. So some of the examples of the ANSI standards are eye and face protection, and we've got the ANSI Z87 standard, and the head protection, we've got the ANSI Z89 protection standard, and foot protection, the ANSI Z41 standard. Those can all be accessed through a number of different online programs. So if you need any additional detail on those, please don't hesitate to use the internet to your ability and capability and take a look at some of those standards in more detail. If there are no ANSI standards developed, check OSHA also, because they have some excellent recommendations, such as with gloves for hand protection, some very good recommendations out there, and in fact some very detailed tables, even the simple OSHA PPE standard that will go over different types of hazards, different types of materials, and it gets very detailed down to different types of rubber, for example, or different types of impermeable solutions for that type of protection. One of the big steps we would definitely want to do is we want to train our employees. We want to make sure that the employers are required and know that they're required to train their employees who must use PPE. We need to train them on when the PPE is necessary. If they can become self-stewards of their own safety, our programs increase tenfold. And as we continue to engage our employees with high levels of training for all different types of regulatory compliance, this is definitely one of those areas where we can partner up with them, truly partner up with them, so they're wearing it, They know when they're supposed to wear it. They don't deviate from those policies and procedures, and it's an opportunity for us to really improve our loss control process and programs through that. What PPE is necessary, how to properly put it on, take it off, adjust, and wear the PPE. Oftentimes PPE may change throughout the day. Conditions can change and create a situation where the employee needs to be aware of that. They also need to understand the limitations of the PPE. PPE is, I kind of always think about young kids who are playing football, and they put on the helmet and the shoulder pads, and they all of a sudden feel like they're indestructible, and it's just not the case. It's the helmet and shoulder pads are there to really protect those certain areas that really are susceptible to injury, but at the end of the day, a hit that's strong enough or just landing on the wrong side isn't going to change things. So we want employees to understand that also. We want them to understand that this PPE is there because we weren't able to remove the hazard in the workplace. We weren't able to engineer that hazard out or use an administrative control to remove that hazard. And so that pinch point exists, and we are going to protect our hands from that pinch point in those cases. Or contact with or against is inevitable, and so we're going to protect when we can. Proper care, maintenance, useful life, and disposal of PPE. The proper care comes with lots of responsibility, maintenance, the useful life. There are certain PPEs that have a shelf life. Even hard hats have a shelf life, and that shelf life can be due to use, wear and tear in the field, or it can simply be due to time. And if a hard hat has been, as most of you all know, if a hard hat's been involved in an incident and there's been impact, the recommendation is to replace it. If the hard hat sat on the shelf for 10 years, there's good theories behind that and recommendations to replace it. Same thing with the PPE that we use every day. There comes a time when it no longer does what it was intended to do. And then at some point, we want to dispose of that PPE. We want to make sure that it is disposed correctly and so that others don't try and reuse that level of PPE. Employers should make sure that each employee demonstrates an understanding of the PPE training before performing the job or task, whether you do that through some level of skill assessment or competency. There's a number of different ways you can do that. And keep in mind retraining when necessary, right? An employer does not believe the previously trained employee understands the conditions for PPE use, might be a good reason to go ahead and retrain them. This is where your incident investigation procedures can really kick in. If you've got a robust program where you investigate near misses, and some of those near misses were directly tied back to an employee with a personal protective equipment situation, there's a good example of, did the employee understand what the safety features were of that personal protective equipment? Were they wearing it properly? Or was there a condition where they had to step outside the norm, whether it's size, fit, comfort, type, whatever it might be? And then workplace or hazard assessment changes. So if your hazard assessment changes due to process changes, due to scope of new construction in your facility, or anything in the workplace changes that causes you to relook at those training situations, we want to make sure we capture all that. And then documentation of all the training. Document. It's really to protect all of us, it's the employer and the employee in these situations, to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to ensure the proper protocols. So personal protective equipment. Are we covered? Do we have our eye and face protection? Hopefully we've got everything we need, and as we continue to engage in new processes in our facilities and in new work environments and in new hazards, that we can address those eye and face protection. And as I said before, lots of companies out there are working very hard to ensure that new technology is coming each and every day. Lighter, better, stronger equipment, whatever it may be. Head protection. You know, do we have a recognized head protection program? Is it a mandatory hard hat in the field? Is it a mandatory hard hat at all times? Is it a mandatory hard hat just during the work environment that creates the potential for a hazard associated with the head and bump protection? Foot and leg protection. We're kind of covering all the bases here. Hand and arm protection. Remember, hands and arms, one of the most injured body parts throughout all of our statistics, all of our gauging of what body parts are injured. Those hands and fingers tend to be one of the highest injured body parts on our person. So really get after those hand and arm protection situations. Body protection. This could be full body, this could be portions of the body, depending on what part is exposed to the potential hazard. In the refining business, most of the folks are going to be engaged with some level of FRC, the fire retardant clothing, and different types of coveralls that protect them from that. Hearing protection, big one here, right? Because at any time we're going to be exposed to hearing levels that are above the standard, then we're going to need to protect our ears, and a big one there because once you've had hearing loss, you're not getting it back. So protect those ears. Lots of options and new advances in fit, comfort, technology. We've got more durable items that are coming out all the time. We've got equipment. We've got different levels of materials that are being used to be more effective with impact, with resistance, with longevity and things of that nature. And accessibility and assistance. We want to make sure that our employees have the access and accessibility and assistance to properly understand what they're wearing, understand why they're wearing it, and really have that level of comfort with the employees so that they're engaged in what they really need to be doing out there, not worried about the personal protective equipment. If you want a regulatory standard reference, it's there. And as I said before, the OSHA regulations are fairly detailed. They've got references to ANSI standards. They've got references to other standards that are in there. Those are available. If you're getting a copy of this presentation, you can simply go there and take a look at those. I am going to open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Dennis. That was a fantastic presentation. I think all of us have learned a thing or two about what kind of maybe changes or just thoughts that need to go into the ideas we have behind personal protective equipment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and take a look at the chats that have come in and the questions that have been asked, and we will go ahead and answer those. And so I'm going to ask the question to Dennis, and he will give a response. And if for any reason you find yourself, with questions after the presentation, what you can do is you'll see Dennis's email address up there. You can either send it directly to him, or you can send that to me, and I'll be happy to send that to you as well. A quick note before we begin, just because it is a question that is typically asked about a copy of the presentation. If you are interested in learning more about PICS, our contractor management process, or you would like a copy of today's presentation, either send an email to the email address I'll give to you right now, or just reply to any of the emails that you've received. Either way, they will both come directly to me, and I can help make sure I facilitate that. The email address is cgutierrez, which is Gutierrez, and it's at PICS. PICS auditing.com. So go ahead and just send in the email to me that you have a request either for more information about PICS and our contractor management services, or for a copy of today's presentation, and we'll be happy to send that to you. So let me just quickly turn over to the couple of questions that have come in and ask those to Dennis, and we'll go ahead and go from there. So the first question that I have here is, my understanding is that an employer can require foot and prescription eye protection, but not necessarily have to pay. And the question is that true? So Dennis, can you go ahead and answer that for us?
Yeah, the standard definitely says that if you're going to require foot protection, you have an option, and that option is to require the employee to come to the work environment as part of their working conditions. They have to require or provide their own foot protection. Now, a lot of plants and facilities out there obviously will do a supplemental program. They'll have some good programs. They work with some of the foot providers or shoe providers, and they'll give their employees some type of stipend so that they can buy a pair of boots, steel-toed boots, for example, once a year. But you're right, it is not required that they provide that at a cost to the employer. And it's the same with the prescription. There are a lot of companies out there that obviously will supplement the prescription program, but that can be a condition of working and coming to the job site with that level of PPE. So you are correct. The foot protection and the prescription eyewear is really left up to the employer to make that decision. Things like hard hats and safety glasses, standard safety glasses, non-prescription safety glasses would have to fall into that category, being provided at no cost to the employee. Great question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dennis. We had a couple people who mentioned that they were looking at their PPE program and what changes needed to be done. And so the question they had is, what would you say are the top 2 PPE tips to start with if you're looking at revamping or updating your PPE program?
So great question. So the first top tip that I would select is do a good hazard assessment. Perform that hazard assessment, determine what we're looking at in the facility, what types of hazards we might be exposed to, so that we can design a PPE program that goes around that. And the next thing I would really say, and this is through lots and lots of investigations and lots of interviews with employees, is make sure you get PPE that fits good and is appropriate for the situation. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of companies out there, as I said, that are doing really good work and trying to determine how can we provide the same level of protection we provided yesterday or even 10 years ago at a lighter, better fit. And that's really going to come down to, you're doing a little research, and I just would encourage you, don't always use cost as a situation. I realize that there are situations where cost is going to drive your decision, but that PPE that fits, that PPE that is easy to put on and take off, and at the end of the day provides you with the level of protection you need, is going to be worn, and is going to be a value to both the employee and the employer in that situation.
Great, thank you. Second question coming in here with regards to foot protection, and the question is, and this is coming in from Beth. I'm having a hard time determining when foot protection should be required. Is there a rule of thumb on weight of materials and height if they were dropped where it could be an issue and foot protection like steel toes would be required?
So I don't have a great answer for that. It's a great question. I really don't have a great answer for that, other than the fact is I would determine through my hazard assessment, is foot protection required? And I wouldn't necessarily take a weight or height or some situation like that or some calculation to determine whether I need it or not. I would simply look at my past experience and my history. If I have a number of foot injuries, I'll give you a real life example. I at one time was working for a contracting company that provided a whole host of different levels of refinery type maintenance workers. And one of the things that we did is we run some draughts. And the draughts were small cranes that had outriggers that you had to put out for the draught to work appropriately and to be balanced and to not fall over while it was lifting its load and things of that nature. And we discovered that through that process of operating that piece of machinery that we had to do not only require steel-toed shoes when working in and around those because of the outrigger potential and the foot injury potential, but we had to engage with other levels of engineering controls and administrative controls, things like backup alarms and things like barriers and barricades and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, we determined that job, that skill set required the feet to be protected. And really the only way to do that was either to require steel-toed shoes or to have, metatarsals and toe guards and things of that nature, some other level of protection. But like I said, it's a great question, and I don't have the specific answer for it. Again, I would recommend that you take a look at your history, take a look at your incidents, and if you've got a level of foot injury loss that's occurring, then yeah, let's go to the steel-toed requirement.
That's a great answer. Thank you. The next question is coming in from Dan, and his question is, are there any particular types of PPE that could particularly benefit from technological advancements. Where are you seeing advancements in hearing protection, clothing, et cetera? So his question is trying to see if there's any specific areas that we see technological advancements in for PPE.
So Dan, I come from the refining background, and so I have a little bit more kind of skin in the game when it comes to flammable materials and flammable protection, and that's really where I've seen some of the greatest strides in technology is with the FRCs, the flame retardant clothing, and the lighter versions that are coming in of different types of, you know, I'll use Nomex just as a brand, one of the brands that's out there, Nomex FRCs. You know, they've really done a lot to get the fit and get the comfort level to the point where the conditions aren't affected as much as something that is cumbersome to wear or heavier to wear. And I'll say, you know, you mentioned some of the other specifics, you know, it's just the materials are just getting so much better. We're just seeing better materials, again, with better fit and with better durability.
Great, thank you. We've got another question that came in from David, and what he said is that he heard that OSHA was taking notice on some of their visits on whether workers were trained in how to use a hard hat, proper fastening, et cetera, or other PPE, and whether this may be left up to the worker. He wants to know if you'd have any input on this, and if not, are there posters or things that they can post in their office that might help with that particular item?
So yeah, it's a great question, David. It's kind of a 2 or 3 part question, and the first part is you're exactly right. OSHA is taking notice during their investigations of whether or not the employees are trained, and there are not necessarily a lot of citations coming back from a serious and willful type, you know, standpoint, but a lot of regulatory and general citations that are coming back to employers so that they can engage in a better training program for them. They do understand that OSHA does understand that there are certain requirements, and you brought up a hard hat, for example. You know, there's occasions where an investigator or even your own, you know, EHS team is out looking at how people are adjusting to the work environment, and when they see an employee with their hard hat wearing it backwards, and they actually take a look at the hard hat and realize that they've actually taken the suspension out, the head suspension piece out of the hard hat, turned it around, and then put their hard hat on backwards. You know, that was never the way that hard hat was designed. It was designed for a reason to have the bump and the impact protection and the bill of the hard hat, whether it's a wide brim or a single cap type bill, in the place where it is. So, you know, there's situations where we're seeing that, and I think that there are some great programs out there from a lot of different companies on awareness, and some of them are poster-based programs, some of them are safety toolbox, tailgate meeting type programs where you can enhance the worker awareness. But at the end of the day, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at some of those programs out there and see what can help you with that.
Great, thank you. From Bill, we have, can you recommend a tight-fitting glove that technicians working with large vehicles, engines, transmission, etc., can use to protect us, as well as being able to handle small items like nuts, bolts, etc.? So
I typically don't want to, you know, throw a company name out there for different types of items, but one of the gloves that we've used and been very successful with is called Mechanics. And Mechanics make gloves that are designed for truly a mechanic, and really the Mechanics gloves are tight-fitting, still give a level of protection, maybe not as good as some of the other gloves with the impact protection and vibration protection and things of that nature, but they allow you to use the small tools, and we found that our mechanics really like those. So in situations where, again, use your loss history as that example of what do we really need. If you've got a lot of hand and finger injuries, those gloves might not be appropriate. But if you're doing the light work where you need to use small tools, those gloves tend to work very well.
Great, thank you. And it looks like our final question is coming in from Martin, and he wants us to kind of go back over foot protection. His question is, in thinking of foot protection, can I require my contractors to wear foot protection?
Thinking of furniture.
Yeah, and he's thinking of furniture movers that come in periodically.
That's a good question, Martin. Again, I would default back to, I'm not sure if you can actually require your contractors unless it's a plant-wide requirement. So it may be something that you want to write into the contract so that prior to the contractor coming on site, they understand what the EHS rules and policies and procedures are, and one of those can be steel-toed protection or some level of Z41 type protection for the foot. It's a tough situation. I mean, there's lots of examples of refineries and chemical plants where they require every person that enters the facility, everyone that enters the gate to wear some level of hard-toe protection. So it's really going to come back to, you know, is it a change in culture? Is it a shift? Is it something that that you're seeing a lot of examples of? And furniture movers is a great example of where I would think that that's a skill set that would require some level of protection. And so I encourage you to continue to look into that. I think it's a great opportunity to save some toes.
Great, thank you. We did have one more question come in, so let's touch on this one briefly, and that is, what is your take on allowing shorts for grounds employees and radio earmuffs? Do you know what other companies are doing by chance?
Allowing shorts for grounds employees. So, well, let me address the shorts first. Obviously, shorts is going to remove a level of protection right away. However, if we're not seeing, I'm assuming, you know, shorts, we're talking about lower leg, you know, it's probably more of a thermal thing, right? We want the employees to be comfortable. We want the employees to stay cool. And so in hot environments, there's a potential for that. These are, you know, shorts are very popular in airports, right? You see a lot of the folks out on the tarmac in warm situations wearing shorts, and we don't see a lot of injuries of the lower leg, but they are wearing substantial shoes at that point too. So yeah, I think you just have to be careful with shorts. Is do the shorts turn into now we're wearing flip-flops and shorts, you know? And so you want to take a look at that for sure. The radio earmuffs. If you're talking about the earmuffs that have usually a standard noise reduction rating of about 20 to 25, and you're actually talking about adding the radio feature into it, I think that is a situation where you don't get as good of ear protection as you would from an insertable that might run up around 28 to 32 NRR. But the radio piece of it, if I'm reading the question right, you know, and having you know, music or some other sound in there, I would just caution you that if there's a need for the employee to not hear the noise that's coming from the hazard, but that there's that ability at some point to hear an alarm system, to hear something that even outside of their normal hearing protection site, that there's an alarm that goes off, that they're still able to respond. And one way to combat that might be to have visual. You know, if you can't have audio type alarm systems, then you have visual, either lights flashing or signs that get posted or whatever that may be. So that's another definite situation that we'll see some increase in exposure and awareness to as we move into, again, wearing equipment that is better fitting or more comfortable.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank Dennis again for taking some time to go over some really important questions, I think, that came in, and appreciate your participation on that. Again, as a reminder, if you have additional questions, please feel free to either send an email directly to Dennis or send an email to myself as well. And again, if you're interested in learning more about contractor management with PICS, or if you would like a copy of today's presentation, go ahead and either reply to past emails that you've received from myself or send that email to cgutierrez@picsauditing.com. We'd like to thank you again for joining us today, and we appreciate your participation, and we look forward to hopefully having you join us on our next webinar. We will send an email for when that will be next month as well. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Take care.